I promised that I wouldn't sing when I got up here. Have to make a joke to make myself feel less nervous. Okay. Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, family and friends, faculty and staff. For those of you who don't know, my name is Zach Ford, and I'm a senior history major here at Southern Wesleyan University, and my project is entitled Moonlight and Magnolia, A History of the Southern Plantation. I'd like everyone to close their eyes for a moment. What do you see when you hear the words Southern Plantation? You probably have visions of a white columned house at the end of an avenue of moss-draped oak trees. Or you probably can probably see slaves working in a vast cotton field. You might even see gentlemen drinking mint juleps and ladies in massive hoop skirts. Or you might also see a whipping post that is stained with blood. You can open your eyes now. What was a Southern plantation? According to Merriam-Webster, a plantation is an estate on which crops such as coffee, sugar, and tobacco are cultivated by resident labor. Two very distinct schools of thought have developed on the history of the Southern plantation. And these schools of thought developed as a result of sectional differences between North and South, and they developed primarily after the Civil War and Reconstruction eras. You have the Northern perspective, which sheds a very negative light on the history of the plantation system, and then you have the Southern perspective of the plantation system, which has a more positive light, like you might see in Gone with the Wind. I have named these two models. The first one being the Southern perspective, which I've named the Terra model after the movie Gone with the Wind. In this model, you see, a white Protestant family that are the owners of the plantation, and they are kind to their slaves, and the slaves are content with their station in life. And then you have the Northern perspective, which I've named the Legree model after the famous slave owner in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, Simon Legree. Just a fun fact, some of you probably don't know that Simon Legree was actually based off of a real-life person who has come to light, or has come to public attention in the past several years. Simon Legree was based off of the character Edwin Epps, who was the brutal slave owner that owned Solomon Northrop for 10 years during his 12 years as a slave. And in this perspective, you see the cruel owners and the miserable slaves. The owners beat their slaves without mercy, night and day. As I was examining these two perspectives, I found that there was no middle ground. You had either a hot or cold perspective of Southern plantation history, and I wanted to find that middle ground. And so, in the 1850s, Frederick Law Olmsted, who was the designer of New York City's Central Park, traveled throughout the southern states and recorded his observations of life on the southern plantation, or as he called it, life in the Cotton Kingdom. In the same fashion, in the summer of 2015, myself and students from SWU's Media Communications Department traveled throughout the states of Mississippi, Louisiana, and South Carolina, where we recorded our observations of life on the old plantation. This is a list of the plantations that we saw. In Natchez, Mississippi, we saw Stanton Hall, Melrose, Longwood. In the town of St. Francisville, Louisiana, we saw Greenwood and Rosedown. In the town of New Iberia, Louisiana, we saw Shadows on the Teche, Nottoway Plantation, Holmes House Plantation, Oak Alley Plantation, Destrehan Plantation, and in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, Boone Hall Plantation. These were my two questions that I had while we were traveling this summer. One, did the plantation conform to either the Terra model or the Legree model? And two, How did the plantation differ from these two models? My observations, each plantation was unique in numerous areas. The houses were each unique, mainly being architectural differences. For example, in Virginia, there was a heavy influence of Georgian architecture. Georgian architecture developed in the early to mid 1700s, around the same time that the Virginia plantations were really, booming. Then at the same time in Mississippi, you saw large amounts of Greek Revival architecture, which was a popular architectural style in the 1830s and 1840s, which was around the time that Mississippi was having its cotton boom. And even in states like Louisiana, you had varying architectural styles. For example, Destrehan Plantation was designed in the French colonial style, and then just upriver at Nottoway Plantation, you have the Greek Revival and Italianate styles all combined into one. Family life differed from plantation to plantation. These differences were based off of religion, economic status, and so on. For example, the Roman family that owned O'Galley Plantation were devout Roman Catholics, but they didn't mind the consumption of alcohol. And then just upriver at Greenwood Plantation, you had the Barrow family who were proud Baptists and saw it as a vice and a sin. There were no Wesleyans that owned plantations in those days, so we don't know their perspective. Other aspects of family life, plantations were not just owned by people of Anglo-Saxon descent. For example, Malmaison Plantation in Mississippi was owned by the chief of the Choctaw Native tribe. And in our own South Carolina, in Sumter County, a 1,000-acre tract of land and 60 slaves was owned by William Ellison, who was an African American. The system of slavery differed from plantation to plantation, and all of these differences were solely based off on the owner's income and their religion and the way that they wanted to treat their property. For example, at Longwood Plantation, we saw a portrait of who they called Uncle Freddie, who was the butler. Now, having a portrait painted was a very expensive and time-consuming process. Just in the fact that they had a portrait of their butler showed that they were very close to him, and it is recorded in the diaries of the family that he was a well-beloved servant who they cared for until he passed away, even after he was no longer able to work. But then also, you have the brutal side of slavery. For example, Rock Hill Castle Plantation, which was owned by the Saunders family in Alabama. Mr. Saunders constructed something that is, in all of the research that I've done, it's been the most unique thing that I found. It was a tower that adjoined the main house. And the tower is where he would lock the slaves every evening to prevent them from escaping. It's said that he was one of the most brutal slave owners in the South. The crops differed from plantation to plantation. You would have one plantation that would grow cotton, and then you would have one plantation that would grow tobacco or sugar or so on. And the size of the plantations varied based off of the crop. For example, the estate of Martha Ford was a cotton plantation that only consisted of 200 acres. The reason that she was able to grow such a small amount of cotton is because there was a specific strand that had been engineered by scientists. It was a stronger strand of cotton, so she was able to grow less of it, but still have a good profit. And then you have John Burnside of Holmes House Plantation that owned over 300,000 acres of land, 98,000 acres being for the production of sugar. He was the largest producer of sugar in North America. My conclusions: each plantation was unique, each plantation was different. The plantations neither conformed or didn't conform to either the Legree model or the Terra model. And one thing that I really got passionate about as we were traveling through these states and seeing these houses is the need for restoration and the need for preservation. It is important that the stories of each of these estates gets out Especially here recently, there's been a lot of divisiveness between the races especially. And I think that if we really hone on the true history of the plantation system, that the wounds of the past will be healed. And that's it. Any questions?
When is the book coming out?
I'm almost done editing it. Almost. Should be done by the end of this week. But over the summer and in the months ahead, I would like to expand on it because there was a lot that I had to leave out. As of right now, it's about a 60-page work. I could probably easily expand it to 100 pages. So.
They're very interesting.
Where did your title come from?
I had asked Caleb to ask me this. The reason being, in my entire 2 years of research, no one has ever asked why I gave it the title Moonlight and Magnolia. There's a scene in Gone with the Wind, it's in the book and it's in the movie, where Rhett Butler, if you haven't seen it, you really need to see it, trust me. Rhett Butler comes to visit Scarlett O'Hara, who is mourning the loss of her late husband, who she never really cared about. And Rhett, she's a terrible person. And Rhett comes to propose to Scarlett. But Scarlett doesn't want to have anything to do with Rhett. She thinks he's a scallywag and, just trash, So she snubs him. But Rhett grabs her, and pulls her into him and says, "Drop the moonlight and magnolia, Scarlett." The reason I gave it this title is because I feel like, Hollywood and even history sometimes has the tendency to gloss over the truth sometimes. And I really wanted to find the true history of the Southern plantation. So. Any more?
When you went to the different plantation houses, did the people who were at and running the estates have any, where did they lean towards your two models, like in their own personal perspective?
I really didn't get the chance to actually sit down and interview each of the guides, just because usually they would have another tour coming up right after we had to leave. The most interesting tour, well, we had a lot of interesting tour guides, let me tell you. They came from all walks of life. But probably the most, he was passionate, and he seemed to be the one that had really, studied it in depth and, knew what he was talking about, was Barney. Tour guide name was Barney at Melrose, which is part of the National Park Service, so, they were educated people that really, had studied the topic. He really felt the same way that I did, that the true stories of these estates should be told, and that you wouldn't have, just a really negative, dark history or a really positive history of these estates. He told us a story about the plantation owner had died, and his son was about 7 years old, and he had no immediate family in the area. So the servants, the slaves, took care of him. And as he grew, as he became a grown man, the woman that had helped raise him, was ailing in years and everything. And he actually moved her into the big house and cared for her while she was dying, because she had raised him.
Zach, might you include any other areas in your final? I'm from Brunswick, Georgia, St.
Okay.
Simons and all that, and of course you know that, so there's a lot of history there too.
Yeah. The work, the paper that I've written does expand on, the different regions. I focus on Virginia, Tennessee, the Carolinas. The reason that I wanted to go to Mississippi and Louisiana is because that seems to be the area where there is the most diversity. In Virginia, you have what was called the American aristocracy. Most of the first presidents came out of this aristocracy, so it was a very closed-off community. And in Mississippi and Louisiana, they were settled much later. People from all walks of life, all different religions, well, all different Christian denominations. settled in this region. So I feel like that's where I was going to get the most, wide-ranging perspective. But the book does include different areas of the South.